Welcome to Healthcare du Jour, where we dish up and digest the latest in healthcare. For the next 30 minutes, sit back as we bring you insight, commentary, and discussion on trending topics to the table, all expertly served up by our host and his guests. Healthcare du Jour is brought to you by Carium, the telehealth platform enabling healthcare's digital transformation, helping you care for people within the fabric of their daily lives. Now here's your host, Matt Fisher.
Welcome back, and thank you for joining as we dive into the hottest topics in healthcare. I'm your host, Matt Fisher. On the menu today is Nathan Burke, Chief Marketing Officer at Axonius. Welcome, Nathan.
Hey, and thanks so much for having me, Matt. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, no, it's great to have you on. And what I always like to do before getting into the main part of the conversation is to let my guests have an opportunity to give a little bit more of an introduction in terms of who they are and what they do. So, Nathan, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Great. So, my name is Nathan Burke. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Axonius, and we're a cybersecurity company that's solving one of the most fundamental challenges that security and IT teams are facing. And that's just really understanding what assets they have and whether those things are secure. And by assets, we're talking about things like laptops, desktops, cloud instances, mobile devices, and then things like medical devices. That's who I am, and that's what we do at Axonius.
So have you always been focused on healthcare, or kind of what brought you into the healthcare field?
Yeah, so this is my third cybersecurity company, and it's funny because I've grown up around, and I'd say like adjacent to healthcare all my life, with my mom being a registered nurse, my grandmother working in mental health, and then my wife who runs medical labs at hospitals. So it's always been like around me. And when I got into cybersecurity, that's been one of the industries that I've seen that has the most need for help with cybersecurity. And I think at the same time, it's the industry that has the most to lose from cyber criminals. And whether that's in terms of just losing patient data or having that out in the open, or actual patient health, and some of the things that we've seen recently.
It's an interesting statement that you just made of seeing the industry as one that needs the most help. One that's I think backed up by a lot of the headlines and other articles that you can see written. But from your perspective, why is it that healthcare seems to need so much help on the cybersecurity front?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of things together. First is just that the types of both information and devices they have aren't as standard as, say, a bunch of PCs, right? If you're talking about making sure to secure things like MRI machines, but also everything that is storing and transmitting patient data, all the way to the operational things where you're just making sure that you're able to provide healthcare, right? You've seen instances of ransomware shutting down a hospital or a healthcare facility. And it just seems to be a matter of, it's hard to cover all of the different moving parts, whether that's ventilators versus something that's analyzing data. There's just a lot to it, and it's a lot of non-standard equipment as well. So just the scope and the breadth of what you're responsible for, but also, and this is something that I never thought of, but we were talking to one of our healthcare clients at the beginning of the pandemic, and we were talking about some of the challenges he was facing, and he said, the one thing that no one thinks about is, I'm now trying to secure an environment where I don't physically reside. So imagine that. I am responsible for a hospital, but I'm not there to secure it. So you think of remote work being an issue when you're talking about your remote workforce, but it's even a different problem where you're the one responsible for securing an environment that you're not in. And so it's this other idea of remote workforce security. So I think all of that together, just a lot of moving parts, constantly in flux and change. And the other thing that we've seen too is that compared to some other industries like finance, for instance, the security and IT teams in healthcare don't necessarily have the big budgets that the others do. And so put those all together and you start to see a big picture, and not to mention the fact that the cyber criminals are targeting these type of organizations.
It's kind of, given all those challenges, and I think you did a great job of breaking them down and highlighting some of the specific issues. How once you've identified all those things, how do you start preparing organizations that you work with to start tackling and implementing improved cybersecurity measures?
Yeah, I think you hit on it with the first thing you said there is the part about identifying things. And that really, that's a lot of our focus and also a lot of the challenge, right? It's very difficult just to be able to identify everything you have if you're doing it manually. And so one of the things that we do is, and our whole approach is this, which is it's not a problem about not having enough data, right? Every organization has a lot of data sources that know about these assets, about these devices, and whether it's a security solution or something on the network or whatever. So the good news is the data is there. It's not something where I'm saying I just don't have the information. The issue is that it's just fragmented and it's in many different systems. And that's our whole overall approach is if you could just grab all of the data from all of these systems that know about these assets, and then you could just pull it all together and put it into one unified view, then you could start asking questions. And these are questions like, do I have unmanaged devices, things that just showed up that I don't know what they are, or things that showed up that really shouldn't be there in the first place. So I think it's a stepped approach, right? First is just having the capability to identify what you have. Once you're able to do that, then I want to check all of these things to make sure that they have the right configurations, they have the right security coverage, and just being able to query across all of these things to say, I want to know anytime I have something that has a known vulnerability or is missing a security control. So it is that stepped approach of if first I can just get that inventory and understand what I have, then I can start asking questions to understand coverage and how everything relates to my security policy or in this case to compliance. And then the final part of that is, well, what do I do once I find something that doesn't adhere to my policy or isn't meeting up with my compliance expectations? And then the final piece of that is, understanding and getting an inventory. It's not like spring cleaning. It's not something you just do once a year. You need to have something in place so that something new shows up, I can find it and categorize it, understand what it is. Or if something changes, so it's a permissions change or some type of setting or whatever that is, depending on the asset type, I need to know about that, and then I need to kind of orchestrate that action. So that's the really general high level approach that we take, and that's what we've seen in the market with our healthcare clients. First, show me what I have, and then we can take it from there.
Yeah, and kind of as you said a couple of times, compliance requirements can drive the need for that, and by compliance, I think it should be obvious that we're talking about HIPAA from the healthcare perspective, and a lot of those actions that you're talking about, to me at least, sound like a really good description of what the risk analysis is, which is kind of that fundamental first step to being able to implement HIPAA security policies. Kind of given the fact that it's baked into the regulations and you can't comply without doing it, do you have any sense of why there's I don't know if reluctance or hesitancy is or the right descriptor, but why this kind of good overview and understanding of what the environment is can be lacking or not as fully developed as it should be?
Yeah, because I think the biggest issue here and the hardest challenge to overcome is the nuance. And as I was looking through, and I've got this here in my notes, as I was looking through the regulation and exactly what you're talking about. So this is the security rule within HIPAA. And so they've got these, it's 9 key activities, right? So it's the first one, which we talked about a little bit here, which is identifying those relevant information systems that store PHI, right? And this is both the hardware and software. And then what you're talking about now is that second part, which is that conducting a risk assessment. And the language was do an accurate and thorough assessment of potential risks and vulnerabilities. And what does that mean? And that's why it's so challenging. I think when you look at that wording, there's some big obstacles there. First, the assumption is that you're able to inventory all these devices, and obviously that's challenging. But let's just putting that aside, even if you knew everything you had, then the questions come to mind of, well, what is an accurate and thorough assessment? What does that actually mean? What is the frequency? And then what do we consider to be a potential risk or vulnerability? Is that a 0 day, or is it just an unpatched system? Is it an unmanaged device? Is it something that, is a legacy system that can only run on Windows 95 and you can never change it or it'll stop working? And then what about things like systems that allow remote access? Let's say you have a piece of medical equipment that can only be updated remotely by the vendor. And so in every one of these, I think once you go through these questions, you start to see that there's just so many exceptions and compromises and really some gray areas that it's hard to know what's applicable and what isn't. And I think even if you had answers to a lot of those questions, there's really some significant technical hurdles to get over. If you just had PCs and servers, right, you could do things like vulnerability scanning or endpoint protection or locking down permissions. It's not perfect, but it's pretty straightforward what the approach would be. But how do you do a security assessment on an MRI machine or an internet-connected insulin pump or a smart hospital bed? In each of those cases, a vulnerability or a risk means something completely different. And so with all of the different types of devices that we have and then the number of them, we just start seeing these exponential questions come up that we need clarification on. And I think all of that rolls up to saying, like, that's why this risk assessment piece isn't easy.
Yeah, it kind of, I think as you're saying, it's, even if you can identify and quantify everything that you need to account for, I think I was hearing you say that for one, you might not even be in control of being able to update or manage a particular device, and it's, things can be so fluid that, the overall process can definitely feel daunting. And, that, to some degree that might inhibit the ability to adequately address.
Yeah. And I think it all boils down to within security and healthcare and anywhere else, it's all about time and priority, right? No one ever has enough staff. And you're just trying to decide, like, what are the things that have the most impact, that are the highest priority, the most critical. And just in what we were talking about, understanding and trying to answer those questions will always roll up to, well, what do I do first? And so it is a matter of that. You'll never have enough time to assess everything, to then also say, I'm going to first focus on those things that are the most critical, but I also, because of the regulation says I've got to do it for anything and everything that could have PHI, it just becomes this question of, well, how do I structure my time so that I am able to address all of these things? And then it's a question of how deep do I go versus how broad do I go? And I think that's just one of the struggles when you are trying to prove compliance to something like HIPAA. You're just going to have so much to do, so many devices, so many assets, hardware and software. So at what level do I get really granular, or just try to cover everything just a little bit and then maybe once or twice a year? And that's something everyone has to face and answer based on what they feel is right.
And kind of, as you said, while can be a lot of organization by organization or circumstance by circumstance determination of what's right in terms of how to do the assessment, the frequency, and as you said, the granularity. Kind of what are some of the approaches that you've seen organizations that you work with take? Yeah,
so just without getting too much into product stuff, like the way that we approach this is very simple, which is we just connect to all of the different solutions that know about these assets and automatically pull in this data. So it doesn't matter what it is. Now, we're able to show every device in an environment and then how it relates to the security policy. So our customers are able to automate that piece, the data collection piece, the correlation, and then understanding how that fits against the security policy. And so in the example of HIPAA, so what our customers do is they first grab all of the information about all of these devices, and then they write queries to understand how they fit up against the expectations in the policy. And that part's just automated. And then anytime something doesn't fit the expectation, they can either automate some of the action or just open a ticket or have a person look at it. So that's the approach is really simple. All of the data is there. If we can just bring it in, make sense of it, let you ask the questions to understand if something adheres to or deviates from the policy or the regulation, you can then decide what to do. So that's how we approach it.
Yeah, no, and I think that definitely makes sense. And it's for those of you just joining, I'm talking with Nathan Burke from Axonius, and we've been talking about the challenges of identifying and developing security policies around all the devices and data points that might be in a system. And and as you're just saying, it's it can be so challenging to be able to break it down and then figure out how to collate and analyze all the different data that you're collecting. And I think building off that seems to build off of one of the other points you're making of, as we said earlier, that you might not even be in control of being able to address what you've identified as the risk. I think you use maybe an MRI as an example where you might identify the risk, but the manufacturer is the one that would have to go and implement a potential change. So are you seeing any type of collaboration or joint effort when it comes to all those different organizations or entities within the healthcare ecosystem to theoretically create more of a collective and overarching kind of security shield?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things that I've seen where there's several groups out there, whether it's like HSISAC or like some of the other industry groups. So like one of the things that I've seen in healthcare and some other big verticals is just that all of the like security practitioners, even if you're competing in air quotes with someone else, that's just kind of out the window. They all share information, whether that's information about tools, about threats, about how they've changed the way that they do an assessment, about frameworks, about changes to regulations and how they've implemented that and put them into action. And so very, very strong information security community within healthcare. And in fact, I was just speaking with someone that used to be a CISO at one of the major healthcare organizations in the Boston area. And he actually brought up a really super interesting point that he's been talking about with other security professionals in healthcare, is that he thinks the single biggest challenge for cybersecurity in 2021 is that every organization is now under HIPAA mandates. And I'm like, wait a minute. No, they're not. It says it in the reg. We know there's coverage. But he's saying, think about this right now, where organizations now have protected health information about their employees that they weren't set up for and didn't know they have. And he gave an example of a manufacturing plant taking every employee's temperature as they come in as a COVID guideline. And where are they storing that? And what are they doing with that? And he gave so many different examples of companies that aren't in healthcare, but now have healthcare related information that could be uniquely identified to an employee, and they're just not set up for that. And so this is something that like he's been on several podcasts and done a lot of interviews around that, this idea that what we started with HIPAA and saying that we know who is covered by this mandate was built in a world where we didn't have employers getting information and data about their employees, like the health example of taking their temperature, or employees sending emails to their bosses saying, I've got to take a couple of days off and quarantine because I've got COVID, right? We never expected this. And so I really thought that was an interesting angle. And that came out of conversations that he's having with other healthcare CISOs. So there's a very, very strong community there, a very collaborative community, and some great conversations happening in that space about how it relates to what's going on right now.
It's actually very positive to hear about that degree of collaboration, because as you said, you really do need to have everyone in the same boat rowing together and sharing the information. Because it seems to be that's the concept of what threat intelligence sharing, or just common threat intelligence.
Yep, absolutely. Yep. So it's both the risks that are known out there, but I think the other piece of it is equally, if not more valuable, which is where they've seen success. So I think sharing that whole threat intel piece to say, this is what we've seen, and these are some of the indicators of compromise or some of the risks that we're seeing from the outside in, but then the countermeasures, how they've worked with to vendors to do things like patching. So it's both sides of that. So threat intel, really important, but that kind of institutional knowledge and how they've rolled out, I think, is super valuable and critical for individual industries, because what someone will do in healthcare is just very different than manufacturing or tech or retail or you name it. So it's really important to get that from the people that are living day to day.
And is that all done voluntarily, or is there any kind of regulatory drive behind it?
Probably a little bit of both. I know that some of these organizations, they're set up as just either 501c3s or just member organizations for sharing knowledge. I know, I mean, a big part of it is driven by regulation, right? So whether it's all focused on a regulation or it's just something driven by or mandated by, and then translating that to action. There's several organizations out there that are member based, and compliance is always a huge part, but there's also a lot of good operational collaboration on there too.
Yeah, and kind of thinking, as you said, about the collaboration and trying to enhance security through those joint efforts. Are those efforts helping? Or from what you've seen, have you seen kind of where there might be deficiencies, either in the regulations or deficiencies potentially caused by only doing a minimum necessary effort to comply with regulatory requirements?
Yeah, it's a really hard question to answer because I think part of it is different from organization to organization. But I also think that one thing that I see when I look through regulations, and you can only do so much as a regulation, especially something like HIPAA, even though it was signed into law in '96 and it's been updated several times since. But it's this balance between being broad enough that you can apply to everyone, but also lacking a lot of specificity, right? And I think that really is the struggle on any kind of regulation like this, where it was built and it was written in a time that is so alien from how we live right now, right? Anything from 24 years ago will be, and I think the specificity, but also like making sure that it's broad enough to adapt for a world that you haven't planned for, right? It's really tough to do. So it's not a knock on HIPAA. It's just a matter of so much has changed in 24 years. And I think we never anticipated the type of devices we've had, but we also never anticipated things like telehealth. And how does that change things? And so I think it's always very difficult when you're looking at a regulation 24 years later, it's easy to pick out holes. But I think the general idea is that there's a lot to it that's broad, but at the same time, either doesn't apply or be very difficult to apply to things like IoT devices and things that don't necessarily have the ability to be scanned or to have an endpoint agent or whatever, right? So it's just trying to match up the reality of the way that we work today with I think the purpose and the mission of the regulation. I think the idea is great, and putting frameworks in place and best practices, really great, but it's very hard to stay on top of it enough to work in a world where everything is connected, where people are working from home, people are giving healthcare coverage from home. It's such a different world that it's just hard to have a regulation that is able to move and change in time with the reality of how we work.
Yeah, no, and your point about the balance that you want to strike between enough specificity but also enough flexibility that you can, as best you can account for that evolution over time. Because that actually kind of goes into a conversation I was having with someone recently of, why aren't the regulations updated more frequently? And at least from my perspective, to some degree, one, that might be driven by you can only do so much by regulatory change. You might need statutory change, and that doesn't happen necessarily as quickly. And, the regulations, you don't want to, I think as you were suggesting, you don't want to be too specific, because if you get too specific, then the technology is going to outpace you and you're going to be in a worse situation than where you arguably are with HIPAA right now, which is you have this very, from some perspectives, flexible rule that even though it pre-existed some of the current technology, you can still be able to fit the newly developed technology into the framework to some degree.
Yeah, and it is a balance, and I think there's the middle ground there, right? I think the middle ground is to look at the things where you should be more specific. And I'll give an example. So one of the things in HIPAA was around discovering any system that stores PHI and then making sure that those systems are periodically inventoried. Now, that's something that isn't specific to a technology, right? If you had a degree of specificity around monthly, quarterly, weekly, whatever, right? I think that degree of specificity at least gives someone enough to work with to understand how that's a priority in compared to all of the other items within the security rules. So I think that there's a lot that can be done there of saying, all right, let's get really focused and detailed on exactly what we mean with some of these things, not tied to a technology or not tied to even like a security method, like scanning, for instance, because that might not work for some devices. So there's definitely a middle ground there. The other point that I will make very, very quickly is that the other reason that they're updated so infrequently is just think of how long it takes to implement the processes just to meet these, because we're talking about big organizations, right? And so it's not something where if you change it tomorrow, next week, I'm all set. It takes years. And so any change has to be very careful because all of the work that you've done to implement to be up to speed and to be up to code already, you can't just throw that out the window and just move very, very quickly. So it's always a balance.
Yeah, no, bringing up the actual real world impact of having to update compliance measures and operations and, so many different areas of an organization is a great reminder. But also, kind of thinking about everything that we've talked about, even though, we're saying that there is flexibility there and, you can have some measures, are there any changes that you would like to see happen that you do think should be considered that can offer enhancements?
Yeah, I mean, I've read through a lot of that of the proposed changes today. Most of them are around things like the fines imposed or the reporting requirements. I know it would sound self-serving. It does, because we talk about asset management. But I think one of the things that you don't see in the regulation at all is that you need to be able to inventory all of the things that you have. And the reason I'm saying that is because if you're just saying, I want to be able to inventory, doing a risk analysis on things I know that contain PHI, to me, anything could contain PHI. And just understanding what you have is that first step. So if you're only saying this machine, and this software has PHI, and the rest I'm not going to deal with, I think that's a major hole and something that needs to be addressed. And it can just be as simple as you need to have an inventory of all of your assets, period. Whether the frequency and the depth and the rigor, put that aside. But I think you just need to know everything you have. If you don't know what you have, you can't be sure those things are secure.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a great point. And as you said, if you don't know what you have, you can't secure it. And a great takeaway, because believe it or not, we are already out of time. I want to thank my guest, Nathan Burke, for a great conversation today. Thanks so much. This was a lot of fun. And thank you to everyone listening. Keep the dialogue going and connect with me at hashtag HCDEJURE. I'm Matt Fisher. Until next time.